Well, good morning, Victory. I don't know if you guys know this or not, or some of you may not care, but for some of us, this is a really big deal. We have left, right, the desert and are moving into the promised land. This weekend was the last weekend without college football, all right? So it's coming. Some of you are excited. Some of you are like, there you go. Some of you are looking at your husband going, I didn't want you to know, right? Yeah, so it's coming. I'm excited. It should be a national holiday in my opinion, but my petitions have gone unheard at this point. We're going to continue our identity series now. And the passage that we're going to go through is one, it's one that you guys have probably heard us say. You may have heard it often if you've been here very much. And as we look through this series, I thought it was one that we should maybe unpack a little bit to explain why do we use this phrase? Why is this particular passage so important? And what does it say to us as those of us who are followers of Jesus? What does it say to us as the church? How does God view us? And the passage we're going to be reading out of is 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. So if you have your Bibles, you can flip over to that. If you have your bulletin or your program, you could open up that. There should be the passage right up there in the front. It'll also be on the screen. And this is what it said. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Does that sound familiar to some of you here, right? This is the sending out that we do as you leave this place. One of the things we want you to know is how God views you as a person, that how God sees you, that we would start to filter our own thoughts and our own actions through the eyes of God. And that we could start to see ourselves through grace-healed eyes, right? Eyes that view humanity, that view the world, and that view ourselves differently because we recognize how God views us. And so this first phrase that he uses here is that you are a chosen people, that you have been chosen, that God chose you. Right? I think there's something within all of us that we want to be pursued, right? We want to be chosen. We want someone outside of ourselves to care about us and to see us as desirable. Maybe for some of us, this is as simple as a job, right? Where a company or corporation, maybe your own, comes to you and says, hey, this opened up and this position, we think you would be perfect for it. Or your boss comes to you and says, hey, excuse me, I see you've been working hard. I want to give you a promotion. Or maybe this is more relational. I can remember when Sharon and I first kind of started hanging out. I knew that I wanted this young lady in my life. And so I just started letting her know that I had chosen her, right? By simply showing up wherever she was at, right? Like it was just, Facebook is a wonderful thing, right? Going to the basketball game. Well, I've always wanted to go to the basketball. She'd go to lunch. I'd show up with lunch, right? Some of you call that stalking. I call it pursuing, okay? I was pursuing her, right? And it comes to the point where she realizes I'm going to be around all the time anyway, right? That there was nothing that she could do about it. I was going to show up, so she might as well be with me. And so we kind of go through this process of dating, and eventually, I don't know about you guys. For me, like the wedding was nothing compared to the moment that I had to actually ask her, right, if she would. And I had designed this whole scavenger hunt, right? She showed up to the first place we met, and then she got in my car and she drove to the first place she heard me preach. And eventually, she came down to this one place, and I had it lit up, and she walks in, and I'm playing the guitar, and I'd written the song for her, and at the end of the line, I get down on one knee and I say, will you marry me? And she doesn't say anything. And I'm like, perhaps I misjudged the situation, right? And then she starts crying, right? And I don't know whether these are good tears or bad tears. I don't know. It could be like, oh, this is beautiful. Or it could be like, oh, I was expecting someone else. I didn't know. I didn't know what she was gonna say. And so finally in my head, I'm just like, this inner monologue's going, say yes. Say yes. I'm mouthing it to her, say yes, And at some point, right, then you're just like, well, say maybe. Say no. Say something, right? And finally she's like, yes, and I'm like, oh, great, and I give her a hug, and I'd made dinner. We ate dinner together. Fast forward a couple months later. I'm standing up on the stage may have set the record for the longest wedding ever. Now, I'm not complaining. It was a beautiful wedding. The planning that went into it was unbelievable. I mean, we had our groomsmen did like this little dance bow thing as they walked down, and they had to practice that. And we had ring bearers and communion bearers, and we had flower girls, and we had wagons, and we had flowers, and she had actual trees down the aisle. There were actual trees that she had, and then she had lantern bearers that took forever, all right? They literally were holding the lantern, putting it up on a thing, opening up, lighting it, and closing it. But we had these children doing this, and I'm just standing there, and in my head, what I'm thinking is, the longer this takes, the more of a chance she has to change her mind, right? And I could just see it in the back. I could see her dad going, baby, if I'm not as strong as I used to be, but if you want to run, I bet I could hold him for a good 5 minutes. That's what I'm hearing in my head. And so finally, I'm just like, I'm looking, like this little gremlin comes inside. I'm like, just light the lanterns, go. Get out of the way. I want to see. And finally, the doors open, and the music plays, and there's this moment of peace in me. Because the fact of the matter was, I knew she was going to come down that aisle. I didn't know because I'm psychic. I didn't know because I'd prayed really hard, although I had. I knew because I knew that she had chosen me. And because I knew that she had chosen me, and I knew that I had chosen her, I knew despite how horribly crazy the rehearsal had been the night before, she was still going to come down that aisle. And that no matter how much sense her dad tried to talk into her about not marrying a preacher, she was going to come down that aisle. Because I knew that she had chosen me. I was hers, and she was mine. And that moment was a ceremony. It was a representation of the entirety of our relationship before and what it was going to be after. But I knew she had chosen me. And this is the imagery that God consistently brings up when he talks about his people. He talks about choosing them. He even uses a sort of a husband and wife, right? We know in the New Testament and in the Old Testament, the times that the church is called the bride of Christ. And that God, when he talks about Israel, his chosen people, he talks about them as being sort of this relationship of a husband and wife. He says, I chose you. We see it in Exodus. In Exodus chapter 6, this is kind of where this language, one of the places this language comes out of. He says, I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. And then you will know that I am the Lord your God. What's happening here is he's getting ready to bring them out of Egypt, right? They are in a rough spot. They are in a downtime. They have been enslaved. They have been persecuted, right? Everything that you would think that wouldn't happen to the chosen people is happening to the Jews. If you go through sort of the Jewish history, you realize that even though they're the chosen people, a lot of stuff happens to them that makes them feel like they aren't, right? There's a line in Fiddler on the Roof where the father's looking up and he says, God, I know that we're your chosen people, but could you choose somebody else every once in a while, right? And that's sometimes how we feel. Right, when we allow our circumstances to dictate whether or not we're going to believe the reality of the situation. And for the Jewish people, it had become easy for them to turn their back on God, maybe he doesn't love us, maybe he doesn't care about us. And so he's about to redeem them. He's about to remove them from Egypt, to give them a new place, to give them the stuff that he had promised them. And he sets it up by saying, I want you to know that you are my chosen people, that I will be your God and you will be my people. And eventually when they get out of the wilderness, he does it again, and they do a whole ceremony around this idea that they are God's chosen people. And Peter is using and reflecting that same language about us, that we are God's chosen people. That God has chosen this idea of the church to fulfill and to continue the promises that Israel was given. That God pursues us. That God wants to be in right relationship with us. We talked about it a couple of weeks ago. Sometimes we view God as this God that's angry, this God that's just sort of setting us up, waiting for us to fail. And maybe we were taught that, whether in Sunday school or from the pulpit, or maybe just our experiences in life have sort of crafted this narrative about God. I remember my dad, when we would talk about this, he said, especially as an early Christian, it was easy for him to love Jesus. Jesus was a lovable character, but sometimes it was difficult to love God because of the narratives that he had been talked about, God the Father and sort of this dictator, this angry deity. And what we want to reshape, and I hope we have throughout this series, is who God is and how he thinks about you and how he cares about us as people and how he pursues us to be in a right relationship with him, that he comes after us, not in an angry way, but in a loving way, that he shows up because he wants us to know that he wants to be in relationship with us, that he cares for who we are. And if there's any truth that we can grab throughout this series, it's that God is choosing you. That he is actively pursuing you. And your feelings on the matter do not stop him from wanting you to be in relationship with him. That in the midst of our rejections, in the midst of our turnings, in the midst of our flaws and our failures and our mistakes, that doesn't stop God, an unrelenting God, from loving us, from caring for us, from pursuing us. So he says, you are chosen. And then he does this next phrase, and for some of us, it may sound a little weird. It's not something that you hear often in our culture. It's not something we even talk about all that much in church, but he describes them as this in the next piece. He says, you are a royal priesthood, a holy nation. Now, this is literally, once again, taken straight out of the Old Testament. When he talks to the Israelites, this is what he says in Exodus 19:6. He says, you will be my kingdom of priests, my holy nation. So what is he saying? We've got to look at an Old Testament context. When you were in the Old Testament, in that sort of ancient Near Eastern context, there were only certain people who had access to God, right? There were certain individuals that that's who if you wanted to talk to God, you had to talk through them, right? If you wanted to have access to God, you had to go find a priest, or in the Greek culture, you had to go find an oracle who would sort of speak this language of God to you. Oftentimes it would be the kings or the royalty, but generally you went to a priest and you would go to this priest and you would say, look, I want to talk to God, or I need this to be heard. I need to hear from God. And you had to go outside of that. And that those priests were they were sort of God's presence in the life of the people. If things were going well in the temple, you assumed eventually things were going to go well for you. And that was sort of the conduit through which it was judged. Whether or not the priests were doing their job, you guys would go to them and they would kind of make sure that you could talk to God. And I think sometimes we hear that even when we talk about the Old Testament. But the fact of the matter was, even in the Old Testament, God starts to shake up that worldview and says, no. Every one of you can have access to me. And every one of you is my representation. If I've chosen you and you've chosen to be in relationship with me, you have access to me. That you don't have to go through a certain system. You don't have to go through a priest. You don't have to come to me and say, Aaron, I've got all these issues. Could you pray for me? I love to pray for you. I will pray for you. But the fact of the matter is, you have access to God. There isn't some sort of power structure that is in place that lets you know whether or not you get to talk to God. And that, I don't know, maybe we take that a little bit for granted now. Like, we're right, it's America. We do what we want. Right? We have these freedoms and we're sort of individualistic and we just sort of have decided that, well, of course I can talk to whoever. Tell me I can't talk, right? But when you start to understand this in a culture that says the only way to get to God is to make a certain sacrifice and to do a certain thing and to do it a certain way, that you have to be the right way and the right words, what happens is access to God becomes magic. You have to say the right incantation with the right words the right way. And that's the only way. And really, you're not getting access to God. You're sort of twisting the arm of God to do what you want, right? If you want it to rain, you go through the whole thing about rain, right? If you want it to stop raining, you got to go through. If you're worried because it's getting cold and the sun's going away, you do this whole. Everything you do is trying to twist the arm of God. And to the Israelites, God says, listen, certainly there will be some of you that perform priestly functions, right? Not everyone performs all of the priestly functions, but all of you have access to me because I have chosen you and you have chosen me. And he gives us access to the throne room. I mean, think about that idea for a moment. Like, have you ever been around someone that's famous? Anyone ever met like a celebrity or someone who thinks they're a celebrity or so? Yeah. You're like, yes, that one. I know those. Yeah. When I was in high school, I was in love, and in love I mean in the least possible way, with a Christian singer. Her name was Jackie Velasquez. I don't know if you guys remember her or not. She sang, she had a beautiful voice, sang wonderful songs, and I was fairly certain that if we ever met, she would understand that we were supposed to be married. And she played a Christian music festival down in Cincinnati, Ohio that we were at, and it was at Kings Island, so you could ride the rides, you could go do the things, and I had bought one of her posters, and she was gonna sign autographs, and I walked up, and I'm like, and everyone behind me knows, they all know that this is my one shot, okay? I'm gonna shoot my shot today, all right? This is the moment I have. And I walk up, and I hand her the thing, and she's like, oh, hey, what's your name? And I'm like, Aaron, and she's like, okay. She's like, how do you want me to sign this? And I was like, your future wife. Which in hindsight was a mistake. And her bodyguards let me know that was a mistake, actually. Because out of nowhere, these two large guys just slowly move in. And I'm like, this isn't going well. I'm like, this is not what I perceived. And she signs it, I think it was like best wishes, right? And quickly hands it to me. And then I get kind of, gently, but definitely persuasively moved along the road to the next place. And I lost all access that day, that moment. I'm sure somewhere there's a picture of me, like when they look up, watch out for this weird guy, right? Like, I'm sure, right? But I think sometimes that's how we think about God. That it's sort of this closed off access, that we have to do a right thing or say a right word, or we have to pray in a certain way, or maybe if we're good enough throughout the week, he'll listen to us at the end, or maybe if we really want something, we show up to church for a while and maybe we put a little extra money in just to kind of grease the gears. And the fact of the matter is, God says that's not the way this works. You have access to me because I chose you, and you've chosen me. And in the nature of that relationship, we not only have access to him, but we become his representative people here. When we leave, right, he goes with us. God isn't sort of stored up someplace in the back of the sanctuary like he was in the Jewish culture. We don't have him in a box with a bunch of walls that only one guy goes to see occasionally. No, God is running rampant through his people. And we are his priesthood. We as a group become his holy nation. We have access to who he is. And we get to take him with us everywhere we go. That's why last week when we talked about this idea of worship, it was so important to recognize that when the Spirit of God is within us, the actions we perform in daily life become worship. That when we go out and we eat, right? We're told in the New Testament, whether you eat or you drink, whatever it is you do, we do for the glory of God because his presence is with us. And when we leave this place, we take him with us. And when we go into a shopping mall or we go into a restaurant or we go into our house or we go to our place of work, we can have his presence with us because we are a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a chosen people. And I love this phrase. I love the word he uses here next. He says, you are God's special possession. Did you ever have something as a kid or maybe as you're older that's just, it's yours? It's just, for Harper, she has these 2 stuffed lambs that no matter how dirty they get, Lammy and creatively Other Lammy, all right? That's what they're called. Can I have Lammy? Sure. No, Other Lammy. Okay. And she knows which one. I never know which one's which, but she knows. She will hold on to these things, right? Maybe it's your car. For some of you, I've seen the way some of you people, you're not allowed to eat in your car, and you wash it 3-4 times a day, right? Which I'm very impressed with, but never have the discipline to do, right? Right? There's an old story you may have heard at some point. There's a little kid who had just worked, and he had built this little sailboat. And he had done everything he could to make it perfect. He'd sanded it down, and he carved it, and he'd painted it, and he'd put the thing on it, and he finally takes it down to this little creek in his backyard, and he puts it in the water. Well, it had been raining that week, and the water was faster than what he was ready, and the little sailboat actually goes out through the creek into the river, and it's gone. And he's devastated. He's absolutely devastated. And a couple days later, he's walking through kind of their downtown, and there's this little shop, right? This little pawn shop. And there in the front is his sailboat. And he goes in and he tells the guy, he's like, "Mister, look, that's my sailboat." And the guy says, "Oh, that's great." He's like, "I built that." He said, "That's phenomenal." And he goes, "I need it back." And the guy says, "Sure, you can pay for it." And the kid says, "No, sir, I don't think you understand. Like, I carved it out, and I sanded it down, and I painted it, and I put that thing." And the guy says, "Look, you can have it. It's yours. But you're gonna have to pay for it." And so the kid goes home and he's stressing out, and he tells his mom, and his mom says, "Well, you can do some chores around the house." And every day he would do his chores, and he would go to the shop, and he would see that boat, and he'd say, "You're gonna be mine." And he would go back and he would do his chores, he would go see the boat, and finally he gets up enough money, and he walks into the store, and he hands it to the guy, and he goes and he takes his boat, and as he walks out, he starts talking to his boat, and he says, "You know what? You are twice mine. Once because I created you, once because I paid for you." We are twice God's. We are twice God's special possessions. Once, because he created us. He loves us, and he created us. And once, because he paid for us. We are twice owned his special possessions. See, when he created us, we rebelled. And not just in Adam, not just one, although that's where it starts, but every one of us makes a choice to turn our back. And in his infinite foreknowledge and his wisdom, God understood that the only way to have right relationship with those that he chose, that those that he created, that those that he loved, he was going to have to pay a price. And in the cross, what we see is the ultimate act of love, God choosing us. We see God giving of himself so that we are twice owned. Once because he created us. Once because he paid for us. We are his special possessions. And over throughout Scripture, we see story after story of what it looks like when God pursues those that he loves. A story of a sheep that has been lost and a shepherd leaving everything to go find it. A story of a coin that has been dropped on a dirt floor, and the amount of work it takes for a woman to sweep away and light up the room to find just one coin. The story of a son who has run away and a father who never gives up. And a father who, when he sees his son returning, doesn't chastise him, doesn't lecture him, doesn't yell at him. He pulls up his robe and he runs to him. We have a God who runs to us, who pursues us. A God who chose you. We're a chosen people. A God who wants to be with us, who wants to give access to himself. A God who wants us to take him with us everywhere we go. A God who not only created us, but paid for us. Twice owned, a special possession. And then the next little part of this explains what our response is. It says that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. There's something about the dark that just makes everything scarier, right? You never, like, there's no horror movie where they're like, oh, it was light out, right? No story starts with that, right? It's always this dark, right? This sort of just, and what happens when we're in the dark, our mind starts to play tricks on us. I know this because it's happened to me. Some of you remember, raise your hand with me. How many of you remember the little bear? It was called Teddy Ruxpin. Do you guys remember that? Some of you do. Yeah, some of you shaking your head. Yeah, for those of you that are a little younger, it was a bear that was stuffed, and we had these things called cassette tapes. And when they didn't work, you had to put a pencil in them to do surgery to fix them. And Teddy Ruxpin, in the middle of the night, is sitting up on my desk telling me a story. You know what happens? I fell asleep. And what I didn't know is that Teddy Ruxpin batteries were starting to run out. And when I woke up in the middle of the night, there was this slow-moving mouth. And the words it was using were not the words of the story. It just went, and I was convinced that this is how I was going to die. And I start yelling for my parents. And my mom runs in the room. And you know the first thing she does? She turns on the light. And when the light turned on, everything changed. Teddy was just a bear. All the monsters and demons that were coming after me, they can't handle the light. And when we start to realize who God is to us and what he thinks about us, the light turns on. We realize we are his chosen people, that he is pursuing us, that he loves us, that he wants us to have access to him. He wants us to take him wherever we go. And that we are his special possessions. Created once, paid for the second time. And what else can we do but celebrate that and proclaim his praise? Our ushers are going to come down now and they're going to pass out communion. And today, as we take communion together, it is a celebration of that last fact, that he created us and now he's paid for us, that we are twice owned. So they're going to pass out the elements that we call it. If you're a follower of Christ today, we ask that you would take a piece of the bread and the cup and just hold on to it for a moment. We're going to pass it all the way through, and then once we're finished, we're going to celebrate and give thanks to God. We're going to praise him that we are chosen, we are pursued by him, that we are twice owned, his special possessions, once because he created us, and once because he paid for us.